I'm sure everyone's just got the same pop-up as me saying that the recording's now on. So I'm Helen Close. I'm a steering committee, a member of Drone Wars UK. And yeah, thank you so much for coming to this event organised by Drone Wars UK and Scientists for Global Responsibility to mark the launch of a new report called Cyborg Dawn, the military use of human augmentation. And that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. I'm really pleased to have two panelists to talk to us for, I think, around 10 minutes each, and then we've got time for questions. The two people that we've got are Peter Burt. Peter is a researcher and campaigner on peace and human rights issues. He works for Drone Wars UK, and he's the author of this report we'll be discussing today. And he works generally on artificial intelligence and autonomy and the development of drones. And then we're joined by Ben Taylor-Green. Ben was awarded his DPhil from the University of Oxford this year, so congratulations, Ben, on that. His thesis was on Empathic Predators on the effects and optics of brain-computer interface, unmanned aerial research. So looking at the use of international brain-computer interface research. So sounds very interesting. But without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Peter to talk about the new report and the issues that it raises.
Thank you very much, Helen. Hello, everyone. Right, so I'm just starting to share my screen now. And you should be able to see a slide with a red background. Is that okay, everyone? Great, thank you. Well, I was talking to a former college friend of mine a couple of weeks ago and mentioned that I've been working on human augmentation. And he does some work in the security sector. And he said, oh, yeah, I was at a presentation the other day and some contractors were telling me about some research they're doing looking at animal blood. And they're looking at blood from species which are adapted to very cold climates and species which are adapted to very hot climates, with the idea of trying to somehow, adapt that for human blood. How are the ethics of that? He said. And I think that little exchange basically summarizes all of the issues about human augmentation, some very strange science and some quite interesting and formidable arguments. So, as Helen mentioned, earlier this year, Drone Wars put out this report, Cyborg Dawn, about the military use of human augmentation. And we felt it was worth spending a little bit more time sort of discussing it with people, because it's coming up on the horizon as a rapidly emerging issue. So here's basically what I'm going to tell you in the presentation. Human augmentation is basically a medical or biological intervention which is intended to improve the performance or the appearance or capability of people. Clearly, it doesn't take much thought to realise that there are significant moral and legal and health risks linked into that. But all the signs are that it's likely to play a role in enabling the kind of increased use of what we now call networked warfare based around uncrewed system. And it's likely that drones in particular will be the first weapons controlled by human augmentation technologies. So human augmentation technologies aim to make humans smarter or faster or stronger. They can be linked to the senses, so they can help you sort of perceive things differently or in a broader range than you can at the moment. So, for example, your eyes allow you to see. If you use a telescope or a pair of binoculars, you can see further and more clearly. If you use an infrared device, then you can see things that you can't see with your natural eye. They can also be used to increase the motor functions. So they can be used to help you run faster, for example, or jump further, or lift up heavier things. And they can also be used to increase cognitive functions. So they can be used to help you sort of process data more quickly, or possibly link in with a much broader range of computerized data systems. And there are a range of different technology types linked in with this: neurotechnologies, sensor technologies, robotics, and computing and artificial intelligence. So as well as enhancing our existing innate skills and abilities, then they can potentially give us new abilities and characteristics. So for this reason, military forces are particularly interested in using human augmentation technology for war fighting, and the UK's military are no exception to that. And research is underway, funded by the Ministry of Defence in this field. There have been some sort of fairly small at the moment funding rounds paid for by a programme called the Defence and Security Accelerator. They funded some small grants on research into telexistence a couple of years ago. So telexistence is when you can perceive that you're in different environments to the one that you're actually in. We're talking things like virtual reality and augmented reality here, and you can influence things in that environment through what you do. There's also been funding for generation after next wearable technologies. So this is beyond things like smart watches. It's sort of skin-worn or implanted sensors, which can be used to sort of diagnose the sense of the state of people, or feed back into their metabolism. And because the Ministry of Defence thought that those first two projects went fairly well, they've now started another broader programme of research into human augmentation, which started earlier this year. And there's been some thinking about this on the policy side as well. And a couple of years ago, the Ministry of Defence's Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre worked with the German military to put together this report, Human Augmentation, the Dawn of a New Paradigm, which was intended to set the foundations for more detailed research and development on human augmentation. And this document sets out 4 core technologies which are of particular interest. So that's genetic engineering, bioinformatics, and brain interfaces, and the use of pharmaceuticals. And this is one of the things that the report says, setting out what is intended. Future wars will be won not by those with the most advanced technology, but by those who can most effectively integrate the unique capabilities of both people and machine. And human augmentation is the missing part of this puzzle. So that's the intention, which looks fairly unprepossessing, and things get worse if you drill down into some of the content of this report. Here are some quotes from it. We can't wait for the ethics of human augmentation to be decided for us. The imperative to use human augmentation may ultimately not be dictated by any explicit ethical argument, but by national interests. And countries may need to develop human augmentation or risk surrendering influence, prosperity, and security to those who do. So basically, national interest takes precedence over ethics, and we're doing this for prosperity and security and influence, which frankly I think is an appalling thing to read in any document associated with supposedly liberal democratic governments. What I'm going to do now is talk through some of the possible technologies and applications that are being considered in this area, starting off with some of the kind of more feasible ones which are under development, and gradually looking at sort of more advanced and sort of on the horizon type technologies. So one thing that has been the subject of focus is wearable technologies, including exoskeletons, which are sort of levered and hydraulic suits you can wear to help you lift heavy loads. And the US Air Force has used them to help porters load cargo into aircraft. It's looking for development of a wearable exoskeleton for soldiers to wear in the future. And on a slightly less ambitious scale, in this country, BAE Systems is looking at integrating physiological monitoring technologies to measure things like heart rate, sweating rate, presence of metabolites, what have you, into the flying suits for pilots of its future Tempest aircraft. Neurochemical enhancement is something that has been used by militaries in the past, and this is using natural chemicals or synthetic chemicals to either help improve cognitive functions like concentration or to promote relaxation. And the hope is that the military will be able to develop smart drugs which can be used to target specific aspects of performance. And the US military have used the drugs dextroamphetamine and modafinil with competence during various wars, but there are risks associated with that. It can result in misjudgment and reckless behavior. And in 2002, some US Air Force pilots who had been administered amphetamines were prosecuted for bombing Canadian forces in Afghanistan and killing 4 Canadian soldiers. As well as using chemicals to influence the brain, then you can use physical methods. So electromagnetic radiation, for example, to either sense or influence the brain's electrical activity. Now, this is of interest to the military because it might allow more rapid interaction with machines and computers and allow ultimately thought-controlled weapons. Clearly, there are challenges here. The electromagnetic signals are scattered and weakened as they pass through bone and tissue, but it's something that DARPA has been working on. DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency of the US Department of Defense. And DARPA have been funding a program called Next Generation Neurotechnology, which aims to develop non-invasive brain-machine interfaces that can be worn like a headset, the kind of thing you can see in the photo there. And DARPA make no secrets about what this technology is for. My thanks to Ben for drawing my attention to this quote from the director of DARPA's neurotechnology program. It's all about working with drones and swarms of drones, operating at the speed of thought. That's the type of things what these devices are really for. The next step on in terms of complexity and difficulty are brain-computer implants. So instead of wearing an interface, then you actually have it implanted in your brain. And this technology is still at a very early stage in development. Clearly, there are many clinical and ethical risks associated with it. But the way it works is that what's called the neuroplasticity, the adaptability of the brain, allows the neural networks to adapt to handle signals from implanted devices. So they can receive, they can send signals to electronic interfaces in the brain. And DARPA have done research on this, and with brain-computer implants have allowed people to control prosthetic limbs and also direct very basic flight maneuvers in aircraft. And then finally, looking in the longest term of all, is gene editing, which is where you directly modify an organism's genetic material permanently. And DARPA has been working in this field as well. and in particular been investigating genes that might assist in protecting against particular medical conditions which are relevant to the military. And the 4 conditions that they're interested in are opioid overdose, gamma irradiation exposure, organophosphate poisoning, and influenza infection. Now, this is a highly complex area. Most genetic traits aren't controlled by 1 or 2 genetic loci, but many of them. So it is likely to be very difficult to alter the genome without causing knock-on effects as well. So just a summary of the current state of play. We're at a very early stage of development. These technologies can only function under laboratory conditions, lots of wires, static, big, heavy equipment, and giving only very crude results at the moment. But at the same time, vast sums of money are being spent on this. And you can see that billions of pounds have been spent on, for instance, the US Brain Project, which DARPA has been heavily involved in, and parallel projects in the European Union and Japan, as well as privately funded trusts like the Allen Institute for Brain Science, which was founded by Steve Allen, one of Microsoft's co-founders. An idea of where this is heading was published by the US Army in a publication called Cyborg Soldier 2050, where they identified 4 specific uses of human augmentation technology, which they reckoned will be technically feasible within the next 25 years or so. And they've flagged up ocular enhancements as one area, muscular control through a wearable bodysuit sensor web, which can accept stimuli and also give stimuli to the body. Auditory enhancement, either to protect against loud bangs and noises or allow people to hear at different pitches or volumes to what they're currently able to. And also neural enhancement of the brain to allow data transfer. So again, here are some quotes from that document. First off, the authors thought that the use of machines to enhance the physical condition of the human species has received a distorted and dystopian narrative in the name of entertainment. So the reason that people are squeamish about this is all of those Terminator films. And with a bit more positive propaganda, then perhaps people might be a little bit more welcoming of the concept. Just in case you think this is going to be used on the battlefield, then it's not. It's going to be used against you as well. Cyborg technologies would also be invaluable to clandestine surveillance, and operators will be able to seamlessly move through crowded streets, capturing intelligence, targeting conversations, and other information that would be digitally stored for later analysis and interpretation. And unsurprisingly, the benefits of that would go to intelligence officers, police forces, and others who would benefit from using imperceptible forms of communication. What are some of the obstacles to uptake of this technology? Well, health is a major one. There are possibly severe clinical risks of unforeseen side effects and long-term adverse effects linked in with all of these technologies. When you're dealing with mechanical devices in the body, if they are powered, then they will need to have a very high performance energy demand for any devices implanted inside the body. They would also need to be connectable if they're going to interface with outside computers and things. So there would need to be a secure wireless link and signal. And again, because they're going into a human body, then there would need to be an extremely high degree of reliability linked to them. There are security risks of this. What happens if a human has a computer in their brain? Could they be hacked or even brain jacked? And that in turn raises issues of trust. what if people were worried that one of their colleagues had been hacked? If you enter secure areas, then you're not allowed to take mobile phones and things like that in with you to possibly capture data. So what happens if a person is effectively a walking mobile phone themselves? And then, of course, there's the issue of data management. Enhanced humans would generate huge amounts of information. So what's going to happen to that information? How's it going to be managed? There are potentially very considerable social impacts linked in with imbalances and inequalities. Would we see perhaps a two-tier hierarchy developing between augmented and unaugmented humans? And another very serious concern is the strategic context. And again, we're beginning to see lots of research in this field and the possibility of an arms race developing. Another interesting question is who actually is going to be in control? We tend to think that the human will be controlling the machine, but we know from experience, for example, even everyday experiences when people drive cars or use their mobile phones, that the human-machine relation is not that simple, and humans behave in different ways when they're using these machines to when they're not. So under some circumstances, especially if very high performance computers are involved, then it's possible that the weapons system will actually be informing or controlling the human through the brain-computer interface rather than the other way around. But despite this, then this will be presented as a way forward in terms of maintaining human control over weapons system, even though there are many, many unknowns here. And ultimately, you know, a question is, what happens if humans and technology become so interlinked that the human effectively becomes a weapon or part of a weapon? So this leads us on into just a scraping of the surface of the very serious ethical issues here. Is it right to engineer humans, especially for the purpose of waging war? This whole field of study is based on the assumption that some human traits are superior and others are desirable. And these were the underpinnings of eugenics and genetic determinism, which underpinned Nazi science and Nazi ideology. And any research in this area is inevitably going to require experimentation on both animals and humans. Just to look at some of the regulatory issues here and some of the possibilities for controlling this future, for controlling this technology in the future. Perhaps the biggest area of focus should be controlling neurotechnologies because they pose the greatest security risks. That might be done internationally by extending the terms of the Biological Weapons Convention, or possibly through a new neurosciences treaty. And another way of keeping an eye on what's going on is using surveillance in universities and academic institutions to give early warning of dual-use technologies of concern in this field. And Ben will be talking a little bit more about that in a moment. What's also very important is to introduce governance programs to set standards for research ethics in universities, so that researchers actually sort of start thinking and understanding the possible consequences of what they might be doing in this field and some of the risks. So that is a very quick run through of what we put in the Cyborg Dawn report, and we'll be able to talk more about that obviously in the question and answer session later on. So thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks very much, Peter. That was really interesting. As Peter said, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So do feel free to write questions in the chat as we go through the go on to the next presentation, or you can ask questions yourself at the end after Ben has given his presentation. So I've written down some questions which I hope we get onto, but in the meantime, I'll pass over to Ben and he can he can give his talk. Thanks very much.
Ellen? Okay, everybody hear me okay? Yeah, good. Get rid of that. Okay, so thanks everybody at Drone Wars for inviting me to do a short presentation tonight at the launch of the Cyborg Dawn report. It's a real pleasure to be here and to hopefully be able to communicate a little bit about my research, which concerns one of the areas of emerging technology covered in the report. So I'm an anthropologist, which means that generally I'm concerned with humans and what they get up to. And as it happens, I've become particularly interested in what scientists and engineers get up to. So the object of my doctoral inquiry became the ongoing research and development of brain-computer interface unmanned aerial vehicle technology, and importantly, its possible futures. As it suggests on the tin, the BCI UAV is an unmanned aerial vehicle or drone controlled via a brain-computer interface. By control, therefore, is meant flight control. So unmanned aerial vehicle or drone technology needs almost no introduction, least of all at this meeting. Brain-computer interface technology, or BCI, however, is not something we hear about every day. Although, of course, on this particular day, we have already heard a bit from Peter about it. So before circling back around to talk about the specific object of my research, I need to introduce BCI technology and some associated ideas. So BCI technology, well, it's neurotechnology, and it works via a process of recording electrophysiological signals emitting from the brain, and then translating these signals into commands for machines. My research exclusively addresses non-invasive BCI technology, which does not require surgery to implement, and uses a method called electroencephalography, or EEG, which essentially involves a hat full of electrodes, as you can see on the slide there. Due to the degree to which BCIs can bypass the neuromuscular system of the body by deriving command inputs for machines directly from the brain, the technology provides hope and increasingly practical benefits for people living with a range of neurological conditions that can cause severe paralysis. Historically, BCI research and technology has maintained a strong connection to this type of user, but for some time now, it has been recognized to have a much wider scope of application beyond the clinical or assistive. So, since around the year 2000, BCI research has vigorously branched out into the development of applications aimed at healthy users. And this change in focus has also brought into focus the dual-use nature of BCI technology, which is to say, in broad terms, that it has possible military applications as well as civilian ones. However, I'm particularly interested in the dual-use problem, which I take to mean that it is morally problematic when an instance of research and/or technology that has proposed or known good uses also risks contributing to weapons innovation. And when dealing with BCI research and technology, the risk of weapons innovation involves neuroweapons, defined here as neurotechnologies used as weapons in intelligence and/or defense scenarios. If we want to keep an eye on this relatively new category of neuroweapons and the conditions of their emergence, an indispensable method is literature surveillance. In other words, systematically seeking out, collecting, and analyzing available published scientific literature. So starting from the published literature in international brain-computer interface research, My doctoral thesis examined the development of brain-computer interface unmanned aerial vehicle technology. The core materials analysed in my research were a set of 84 papers, which included journal articles, conference papers, and 2 master's theses. In addition, a small number of insightful online video interviews with BCI researchers were conducted, although only 2 of these were with people who had actually worked on BCI UAV technology. And I did have quite some trouble getting anyone to talk to me about their research on BCI UAV technology. Practical research involving BCI UAV technology has been done by teams based in 19 countries so far: Colombia, Brazil, China, Denmark, France, India, South Korea, Malaysia, Mexico, Norway, Peru, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Singapore, Taiwan, the UAE, and of course the USA. Notably, nearly all of the studies done so far have used small, off-the-shelf quadcopter type drones, like this one on the slide, to test BCI control strategies. In many cases, the user of the system is provided with real-time visual feedback from an onboard camera on the drone, so they can control it effectively when it is out of their line of sight. This is a feature required in any real-world application of the technology. In early versions, visual feedback was provided by a computer screen, but more recent versions use first-person view headsets. And in all cases, the connections made between the brain and the computer, as well as between the computer and the drone, are wireless, which is, of course, another essential feature for any real-world applications of this system. So the dual-use problem is evident in the stark juxtaposition, and sometimes I should add, even within individual papers, of 2 proposed future uses for BCI UAV technology. The first as an assistive technology for severely paralyzed patients, usually cited as living with neurodegenerative diseases, and most specifically, it's amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, which we call motor neurone disease in the UK. And the second use is as a neuroweapon. Even more precisely, as a BCI-type electronic neuroweapon system in the form of a probably lethally armed drone, or as the case may be, very soon, swarms of such drones controlled via BCI. And I should mention that, to my knowledge, when this system does emerge, it will be the first example of this kind of weapon ever to exist. So rather than involving the larger high-altitude, long-endurance type drones emblematic of early 21st century warfare, such as the Predator and the Reaper, which have traditionally situated the user at a great remove from the battlefield, in my estimation, the kinds of drones likely to be involved in this future neuroweapon system are likely to be on the smaller end of the scale, and would probably be used by ground troops in urban combat. So here's one candidate example of the kinds of armed small drones that I believe to be heading towards being controlled by a BCI. This is from the Turkish arms company Sisgard. It's called Songar, and this example has a machine gun underneath it, but there are also versions in existence that have grenade launchers and other forms of small arms. And this is a very similar example, which actually predates the one we've just seen this is from Duke Robotics in the USA, called TCAD. And, once again, it can be interchangeably fitted with a range of American-made small arms, actually. So while these are essentially what I take to be likely candidates for the kinds of drones that might be used in this weapon system, obviously, these examples do not exhaust the possibilities that of drones that might be BCI controlled for military purposes. So, returning to the published literature on BCI UAV technology, it may interest you to know that after over a decade of research, with many papers mentioning paralyzed patients as possible future users of the technology, only one study has actually involved paralyzed patients or people with physical disabilities of any kind. And perhaps tellingly, in that single example, the researchers were thinking about the technology as a sort of toy, rather than something much higher up the list of priorities for people who are possibly bedbound with a neurological condition. Should also mention that there are a few other seemingly innocuous possible future uses proposed by authors of papers on this technology, which are ostensibly neither weaponized nor clinical, such as for drone racing. But for obvious reasons, I've assumed that it is the risked and sometimes even cited possible future use of BCI UAV technology as a weapon system that deserves most attention. So on that front, as far as the literature goes, most of the research is not done in the knowledge of or in immediate proximity to the knowledge of the risk of weapons innovation, by which I mean that most papers do not declare military funding or association, and nor do they describe any weaponized uses. However gently they might do this, and I assure you that most of the time they do this quite gently. Of course, the literature only goes so far in terms of what we can know through it, but really that's a methodological question for another time. Nevertheless, I can confirm that several papers declare military funding from sources including the US Army Laboratory, the Indian government's Defense Development and Research Organization. One paper from 2019 is even written by researchers working at the Air Force Engineering University of the People's Liberation Army of China. And beyond the set of papers that formed the core of my analysis, in 2019, as Peter was mentioning earlier, DARPA in the US actually announced that BCI UAV technology was a key element of its N3 portfolio. Further, a handful of papers openly demonstrate their authors' knowledge that the technology they work on has possible military uses. And most fascinatingly, from my perspective, this is usually done alongside mention of uses for disabled people. And my favorite example of this practice is the following quote from a paper published in 2018. And these authors write, in future, some conceivable applications are as follows. In hospitals where patients with severe disabilities could use them for transporting objects. In battlefields where wounded soldiers could use them to proceed with combat. And in space where they could assist astronauts to accomplish multitask missions outside the spacecraft. And you may notice that the soldier imagined in this quote is wounded. And although I can't discuss this theme here, it is something that I think about a great deal in my doctoral thesis. So my assessment at present is that for the time being, whether the researchers involved know it or like it or not, all research with a view to improving BCI control strategies for aerial drones is dual-use research into a dual-use technology. Unfortunately, therefore, even that research which sincerely aims itself at improving life for severely paralyzed users is also dual-use due to the context. So ultimately, BCI UAV research at the moment poses a tangible and indeed knowable risk of weapons innovation. therefore, some, myself included, may find it somewhat astounding that research is still being done and published on by university-based academics, when the body of literature documenting this technology's story so far is frankly riddled with signs that point to the risks being posed. Unfortunately, it's probably too late to do much about the BCI UAV as a future weapons system, in the sense that the damage has been done and it's likely sooner or later to emerge. But while it's too late to do much about the BCI UAV itself, it's not too late to engage with the BCI community on the deeper but still very specific subject of neuroweapons innovation. So from an intellectual activist perspective, I think a promising way ahead is to begin a conversation in earnest with and between BCI researchers about the ethics of conducting knowingly dual use and just straight up weapons research. Now, this may sound a very basic aim, even somewhat mealy-mouthed, given what's ultimately at stake, but actually it's just a reflection of where we are. And what I mean by this is that, to my knowledge, there is currently no evidence of any serious discussion between BCI researchers of the moral risks and material realities of contributing to weapons innovation. So in the interests of getting this very important conversation going, I recommend first focusing efforts on the BCI Society. The BCI Society is the major international professional organization for BCI researchers, with 300 plus members located in over 24 countries, and whose aim is to foster research leading to technologies that enable people to interact with the world through brain signals. As I see it, the BCI Society is a key stakeholder when it comes down to the future of BCI research and technology, which means, therefore, that it has at least some responsibility with relation to the development and proliferation of the next generation of BCI-type electronic neuroweaponry. As it happens, the BCI Society, which was only formally established in 2015, has so far conducted 2 surveys of its members on the subject of ethical issues, the results of which are set out and discussed in 2 papers by Nijbour et al. And Pham et al. Efforts were even made in the most recent of those papers by Pham et al. To develop a set of ethical principles intended to inform and guide BCI research specifically. However, the ethical issues pertaining to BCI raised in these papers are on the whole internal ethical issues. And by this, I mean that they concern users of BCI and the treatment of research subjects. And there is no doubt that these are important matters. Nevertheless, my interest is on the contrary, directed towards those ethical questions pertaining to BCI that would be considered external and concern, in this case, non-users of BCI technology who may be affected negatively by it. So I say on the whole, these ethical discussions have been internally focused because the proposed ethical principle of social impact, which emphasizes the importance of recognizing that BCI technologies can have broad social effects, appears to have an external ethical focus. The topics raised so far in relation to a principle of social impact include a commitment to democratic representation and transparency in BCI research, and to making BCI data more available, and so on. So, as it stands, this principle has not yet been extended to cover dual use or weapons research. But in the hope of beginning an ethical conversation with and between the BCI Society, I believe that being able to frame the problem of electronic neuroweapons innovation involving BCI as coming under the externally focused ethical principle of social impact, and therefore already in the society's own language, represents the most promising way ahead. And I'll just end with this quote from the philosopher John Forge.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that really interesting presentation and for giving us some ideas on actions that we can take. We do have some time for questions. I was wondering if there are any questions from the floor. If you have a question, please raise your kind of electronic hand, and I'll ask you to unmute. As I said, you can also write questions into the chat if you prefer, but we have one question already from Roger. Please go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, I think this has been one of the most scary presentations that I've heard for a very long time. I've obviously been, but I have obviously been worried about artificial intelligence for a long time as well. The thing is that so many of the people who talk about these are all decent, ethically driven people. And I worry about the particular concept of malicious actors in rogue jurisdictions. It's all very well decent people having conversations and having international treaties and so on, but not every country is decent and not everybody is decent. I mean, I were always worried about humans. I mean, and the awful things that humans do to each other. We've got to look at the situation in Ukraine, look at the situation in Yemen, look at the situation in Israel, Gaza, and lots of other places around the world. I just don't see how we can trust humans to do anything right. And I don't know, how can we mitigate the dangers from malicious actors in rogue jurisdictions?
Thanks for that, Roger. Peter and Ben, do you have a response? Peter, would you like to go ahead first?
Okay, thanks, Helen. Clearly, there will always be bad people around, but not everyone is a bad person. And there are things that we can do to help govern us all. So, for example, if we really sort of despaired of humanity at all, and if we kind of felt, oh well, there's no point to doing anything because nobody will pay any attention, that's effectively saying, well, we don't really want any laws at all because nobody will comply with the law. So do we really want that kind of world where, you know, there are no laws and nobody is obliged to show any respect to anybody at all? Clearly nobody does want that kind of world. I think part of the problem is because of the way in which society is driven by, for want of a better word, capitalist forces, where the incentives are to gain money, to gain power, and to achieve them without any consideration of how you do so. I think there's quite a lot of looking back historically, archaeologically, over many millennia, a lot of evidence to show that humans are sociable organisms who work together, who rely on each other, and for whom society and community is important. So I think we can actually, play on that and draw together the, the best of humanity, if you like, to sort of govern our worst instincts. At the moment, as I say, it's in crude terms, it's capitalism which is stopping us doing that. So, yeah, I think the issue is that we can, rely on humans to work together, taking sanctions where necessary against people, who, as you say, are beyond the pale, Roger, who we can then evict, if you like, from normal society. So I think things aren't brilliant, but they're not appallingly bad.
Yeah. If I can just come in on that. That was a really, really interesting sort of question / statement from you, Roger. I think we all worry about malicious actors and about humans in general. And to be honest with you, I think a healthy dose of misanthropy is crucial. But as for what can you do about it if there's always nasty people around? I think really the basis behind a lot of my thinking and writing is that a lot of this begins with scientists and engineers. Wars couldn't be fought in the way that they are, and so on. People wouldn't die in the same ways that they do were it not for the technologies that scientists and engineers bring into the world. So, my very kind of pointed take on it is, and I think this is absolutely something shared with scientists for global responsibility. The point is to begin instilling values, encouraging conscience, essentially through education in the scientific community, surely, but also stigmatization. I think that's another really powerful and largely untapped force in certainly in like the university environment, which, as Peter, it's another arena that's swamped by capitalist forces, but also wrapped up in the perils of power politics that essentially structure international relations. So stigmatize, encourage conscience, and educate, because things don't have to be as bad as misanthropes often perceive them to be.
Thank you. It's just that the things like gene editing technology and so forth is so much more easily accomplished than creating an atom bomb, for example. And I just worry about, okay, thanks for your comments.
Thank you. I think that it is, it's very important to look at kind of regulating the engineers and the scientists that kind of have these ideas before the politicians and the international relations people and the warmongers get involved and kind of know and think about the possibilities of this technology. I see we've got a question from Andrew. So Andrew, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, this is Andrew. Hear me all right? Yeah. I went to college as an electronics engineer in around about 1980. A little bit earlier than that I started, and a little bit later than that I finished. Most of the boys, and it was blokes mostly, worked for the military one way or the other, in Kent, in sort of out of London, and quite interesting the attitude. Some of them said, well, at least my work doesn't do anything, doesn't work. What I do doesn't work. A lot of them could talk of something of very fine detail, of something that was almost trivial, and talk hours about it, but never say anything about killing people or anything, which was basically what they were doing. But yeah, it's a problem. It's sort of money and needing income and family and capitalism that seems to be the problem, not that people are all unkind and nasty. Anyway, that's my observation. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a very mundane problem, really, in so many respects, isn't it? It's almost banal. Scientists and engineers get wrapped up in these things because they want to further their career doing whatever little project comes next, and whichever funding source will flow. So yeah, that's interesting.
I think they also perhaps get tied up in the concepts and the ideas, and don't necessarily think about the kind of the implications. I see we've got Stuart with his
Sorry,
hand up.
so can I just quickly chip in on Andrew's point, if that's okay? Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. That was an interesting observation. And I too have observed that, there is a tendency among scientists to be, if you'll forgive the casual expression, but very, very geeky, and to be wrapped up in the kind of mechanics of what they're doing and not the bigger issues. Looking back on my own scientific education, I think that approach was encouraged in many ways by the academic environment in which I was taught, where there was very little consideration of broader issues, real world issues, ethical issues, and the focus very much was on that science and that technicality. So that maybe is one way in which we can perhaps encourage people to take the kind of broader outlook and consider some of the risks in the way that Ben was explaining in his presentation. Another thing which I think it's important to remember is that the military, the government, big corporates, they encourage people to think positively about the science they do, no matter, how damnable it might be, if you'll forgive the impression. So at the moment, there is a big push in the tech sector to encourage tech workers in the computer sector to work on military projects for companies like Palantir, for example, and Anduril, with the line, "You're fighting to save American lives, you're fighting for our values if you use your skills in this area." Obviously, that doesn't stand up to a lot of scrutiny, but it will perhaps appeal to people who, don't think particularly deeply about these issues and have been conditioned with all of the, the usual duty to country, all of that kind of stuff that we hear every day through the mainstream discussion. So I think these are the factors which are kind of pushing people in that direction, and they are in many ways manufactured, and they can perhaps be overcome if we wanted to do things differently.
Thanks, Peter. I'll pass over to Stuart now, who's got his hand up.
Thanks. Yeah, they were excellent presentations. Thanks very much for those. I guess the point I wanted to make was around ethical discussions around scientists and engineers. I think Ben's very right when he talks about the importance of education, ethical discussions within science education, and that's really important. And trying to encourage those in different forums in different ways, whether it's at universities, at schools, or in consideration in wider society is very important, and getting funders to attach more attention to it as well. Another aspect is just the importance of getting any discussion when researchers are working at universities. A lot of researchers actually will shy away from publicly discussing ethical issues around their research because it's difficult, because they might get asked awkward questions, they might be publicly embarrassed, and it's something that we found when we try and organize discussions involving academics around military funding in universities, around particular types of military or weapons related research at universities, and how discussion is so quickly shut down, and even when there are the occasional times when researchers are willing to speak publicly and willing to discuss openly, their funders will discourage it if they've got any military funding involved, and the universities often will help. I mean, one of the experiences we've had is you'll get you'll try and organize a discussion around the ethics of military funding at a particular university, and some students will try and organize something, and I or one of my colleagues will attend as a speaker, and then it's difficult to find someone who will discuss the issue from an opposing or competing perspective. And then the university administration intervenes and says, oh, well, you can't go ahead with this event unless you have a balance on the panel, but no one's willing to debate you, so the discussion doesn't take place. And that's a really it's an indirect way of suppressing debate on this issue that I find that we found universities will engage in. So I think Ben's idea of trying to talk to professional bodies is very valuable, and it's interesting to see that the BCI Society has been set up recently, and they've even started thinking about ethics and doing surveys. So I very much encourage you to pursue that. And yes, it needs to be done. It's very difficult, but we kind of need to keep banging away at this issue and getting discussion on universities where it can be seen by students, particularly early in their careers, so they can think about this early enough and then maybe go, well, actually, maybe I don't want to work in that area. It's not as rosy as I thought it would be. And it certainly, I mean, I did my first degree in engineering, and I was sponsored by an arms company, and you know, I spent a year working for them in an industrial placement before I kind of thought, no, I really don't like the ethics of this. But it wasn't because of discussions at my university. It was wider discussions in society and talking to campaigners and peace activists that sparked my interest. So yeah, that's why that's so important, to get that wider perspective as early as possible in your career.
May I just briefly come back at that? You know, I know you work on climate issues as well, and I think, you know, my kind of daydream about this is that the way that essentially connections to fossil fuel companies and so on are now being policed within universities and within wider society. You know, the stigmatization of involvement with life-destroying endeavors for profit. Well, you know, surely the time will come where this issue is taken maybe in a similar way. I personally think it's similar scale and importance in terms of issue, really. So.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stuart. Certainly some very familiar themes in what you said there from my experience too. I think what we're missing here is the notion of any leadership on these issues. Nobody, you know, is giving an ethical lead on anything in the UK at the moment. Certainly corporates will not do that. Government are not remotely interested in doing that either. Teachers are bound by the national curriculum. In terms of universities, you don't get to be the vice chancellor or the provost of a university by rocking the boat and asking awkward questions. So nobody is going to show that kind of leadership at the macro scale. But, you know, we have seen how it can work in some fields. If you look at what happens in Scotland and the Scottish government and the issues on nuclear weapons in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK, you know, there's a very strong majority against nuclear weapons in the UK, in Scotland, unlike the rest of the UK, precisely because the Scottish government has shown leadership and have spoken out on these things and have said they're not good things, we don't want them to happen. So that kind of leadership at the senior level is very important. Lacking that, Stuart, I think you're right to take the approach that the sooner we can start to engage with young people, the better, either at universities or even in schools, to start them to sort of think about these things and think that there is a bigger world than just sort of making money and doing cool experiments. Then I think in that way we will reap dividends and save ourselves from our own destiny, if you like.
Thanks, Peter. We've got a question from Chris. Chris, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, Helen. Yeah, thanks very much. Stuart and Peter have just pretty much covered it really, but I was going to say in the report that Peter referred to, the MOD report from 2001, it kind of directly talks about the fact that the life science departments in universities have what it called an unsophisticated relationship with certain government departments and the private sector, you know, as opposed to other, you know, university departments who have much a better relationship with those institutions, and that relationship, particularly in the life sciences, needs to be revised. Was its recommendation. So I don't think it's kind of like general embarrassment by academics to talk about this stuff. I think we all know that academics very much like to talk about their particular focus. I think there was a real push from the MOD and from the private sector in particular for academics not to talk about this stuff. And you know, I very much recommend what Peter and Stuart were saying about the need to kind of talk to young people and talk to early year scientists on this. So just to reinforce what they were saying about that, really.
Thanks very much, Chris. We do have some questions in the chat about the BCI technology in UAVs and if it would be considered man-in-the-loop technology when it comes to autonomous weapon systems. And I have a kind of related question to that, which is who would be legally responsible if someone with a BCI UAV, if there was a violation of international humanitarian law, for example, I guess where does the responsibility lie in those kind of actions? So I guess first to Ben and then perhaps over to Peter as well, if for any insights into that.
Sure. Yes, in short, yes, it's a man in the loop or human in the loop type technology, which of course provides you know, a contrast to autonomous weapons, which is essentially where most of the kind of ethical discussion has been focused in recent years. But as for the legally responsible, you know, who would be legally responsible? Well, I'll pass to Peter on this, but as far as I understand, it would be a grey area. But I don't see why it would have to be a grey area. You know, I think it probably depends on who you talk to, but I'll pass on to Peter about that.
Thank you,
Go
Ben.
ahead, Peter.
Thank you, Helen. With regards to brain-computer interfaces and whether it's kind of human in the loop or on the loop or whatever, there's a sort of follow-up question which is interesting as well, linking into this, which I'll just spend a moment talking on in the chat, asking why it's better to control a drone via an integrated Neuralink than a tablet with some kind of controller. And the advantages here, as far as the military are concerned, you know, those microseconds in reaction time, even that very small amount of time, if you can get in first with your action, with your shot or whatever, you know, could mean the difference between winning or losing the war. So that is why the military are so interested in this kind of technology. Whether it counts as kind of in the loop or on the loop, I'm skeptical as to whether it gives the amount of human control that perhaps is advocated by people in favour of this technology. Because we know even from the kind of automated weapon systems that we have around now, things like the Patriot missile defense system, in many ways, although that system, you know, is overseen by a human, the human is not necessarily in control of it. because things are happening very quickly. There are many cognitive stimuli facing the user, many things popping up on the screen all at one time. So if the system says, recommendation, target fire, it's very difficult not to follow that recommendation, especially if in a couple of seconds later, you might yourself have been blown up by an incoming enemy missile. So I think the degree of human control that we have on these systems is not as great as we think it is at the moment. There are also issues of machine bias as well, where we are inclined to do what the computer says because it's an objective process and it can't be wrong, can it? So these are all kind of issues which are kind of make it problematic when we talk about things like human control. Even if the system is hardwired into a human brain, does that really make any difference? I would say that in terms of the biological issues involved, the brain is working in the same way, the human part of the system, the wetware is working in the same way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's kind of making the decisions if it's being working in parallel with a very powerful artificial intelligence system with large amounts of data which can be kind of drawn on and which will kind of present, again, something which is seen as a definitive answer. So I don't think that the human is necessarily in control either on the loop or in the loop in these kind of situations. With regards to the legality of this, Ben, you drew my attention to an interesting paper by some researchers who looked at this. I'm afraid I can't remember the name of them. It might be in the Cyborg Dawn.
Gregor Knoll.
That's right, Gregor Knoll, that's right, yeah. Who basically concluded it was not possible to determine the legality of these things. It is simply too complicated and there are too many factors and too many unknowns. So I think that is probably the best we can do in that field, I'm afraid.
Thanks very much for that, both. That's really interesting. I found this discussion fascinating, and I've learned something new today, which is the term BCI UAV, which I hadn't come across before. But in terms of researchers and campaigners and people interested in this field, are there like key things that we should be looking out for, kind of that the government might be doing or talking about, that could indicate that they're working in this area more or spending more money, or key terms and phrases that perhaps we should be looking out for universities saying, or anything like that, just in terms of how we can keep ourselves kind of really up to speed on this topic and informed and active in the debate going forward. Peter, is there anything you can think of we should really be doing?
Well, I think Ben has kind of flagged up perhaps the main thing that we need to think about, which is engaging perhaps with academics in this area. And clearly the BCI Society would be a good place to start. I think, this is something I always say, but I think it's important, is for us to maybe show the leadership when it comes to ethics that politicians and beacons of industry are not showing, and to sort of be willing to say, actually, this is not right, this should not be happening, you should not be doing this. So even in sort of, everyday conversations, we can sort of stand up and say, actually, I don't think that's a good idea, that's not wrong. And, that helps shape people's views and people's influences.
Thanks, Peter. Ben, do you have anything to add?
No, I couldn't agree more.
Great. Do we have any further questions from the floor? Andrew, go ahead.
Hi again. Yeah, it's just an observation that if you go back to Doctor Who in the 1960s, warned us of all these things. Daleks with polytronic brains that trained the animal part of the machine. And we carry on and do it. It's quite scary, really. That's it.
It is indeed. I think we're drawing to the end of this webinar. But Peter and Ben, I was wondering if you had any closing thoughts at all to wrap up. Any final words you'd like to say?
Again, I think just to say this is obviously a worrying topic, and it's the kind of thing that it's kind of easy to feel demoralised about. But remember, as with all of the things that we kind of talk about with Scientists for Global Responsibility and drone wars, the stakes are high here. So don't give up. Even though the powers that be have the money and the influence, there are far more of us thinking along our lines and concerned about these things than there are of them. So do keep talking about them, do keep pushing pressure on them, and do keep working to build a change. And thank you very much, everybody, and well done for all the work that I know you do in this field.
Thank you, Peter. Ben?
Well, on a similar theme, work remains to be done, and it's worth doing. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much. Thank you to everybody. Well, thank you to our two speakers, and thank you to the really interesting discussion that we've had tonight. So thank you everyone for participating in it and for coming along. And I'm sure there is a lot more work to be done on this, and I'm sure this discussion will continue. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Alan.